G'day, listeners. You are listening to the Natives Roundabout podcast. I'll be your host, Trent, and today the ANA National Governor, Matthew Grant, will be joining us to discuss the Australian economy and land monopoly, and we'll be doing a reading from Bernhard Wise's 1909 book, The Commonwealth of Australia. How you going, Matt?
Good. Yeah, this would be a good one for all the economics nerds out there. They'll either love or hate this one, but we'll have a good chinwag. And I think the objective of this podcast, in many ways, is just to discuss like some lesser known economic theory in our nation's history, and just it'd be worthy of people's consideration and to do their own further reading and stuff like that. But yeah, it should be good.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, before we get too far into it, let's start by reviewing some comments off our last episode. Nomad Living 2212 said, "Are the natives in the room with us now?"
Can confirm.
Yes, yes, we are. And Jackson Pay said, "How does the ANA feel about volunteer work in traditionally Australian institutions, i.e. Scouts, Surf Lifesavers, RSL or state country fire services? Is it encouraged? Is there a plan to influence to bring them back to their roots?" Got any comments on that, Matt?
So very favourable. I think whether or not there's an ulterior purpose of like returning these things to their roots, there's still a great benefit in being involved in community organizations. Like, not only on a personal level will it give you a greater sense of satisfaction and community connection and all the rest of it, and allow you to build different skills and competency. But it is, from a metapolitical point of view, it is a way of building your social proof of being a competent, trustworthy person. Eventually, I mean, most people who are interested in politics eventually have the dream that they will be entrusted with steering the ship of state in some way or another. And so being engaged in service to the community and flexing your volunteer energy and showing your devotion and loyalty and learning is all very positive. And a side mention as well, obviously for the ladies who are ineligible to join the ANA, always strongly encourage them to look at the Country Women's Association, get involved in the CWA, which is historically a great patriotic organisation for women. Should be getting involved in that. Men should be getting involved in their community fire units or in the local any other kind of volunteer SES kind of stuff, or even just local Greening Australia groups, landscape preservation, conservation groups, hunting groups. There's all sorts of things that you can do which will add more value to your life, build your skills and your credibility. I think they're all worthy of doing.
Yes, I very much agree. All right. Next comment from Pareto's 80% Slugger said, in reference to a comment we made in the last episode, "You're not building a commune, you're replicating something like the township of Orania in South Africa. Great stream, gentlemen." Thanks for that comment, Pareto 80% Slugger.
Name.
Yeah, well, we're not exactly trying to replicate Orania. We're not in the same situation that they're in. So
yeah, we did discuss like intentional community and all of that, which may come down the line, but it's not in our short-term strategic goals, I wouldn't think. But one day, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, if the situation warrants it, then definitely that's something that we'll go towards.
But with that said, however, like by the very nature of our branch structure, we are creating more real life integrated communities of people that are geographically proximate to each other. So it's like a quasi-Irania, except we're also neck deep in being culturally enriched by all the diverse new entries to our country. So,
all right, and my Mercia said, "Thanks, fellas. Great discussion. The work the ANA is doing to lay the foundation for Australian nationalism is in contrast to the many well-meaning, flash-in-the-pan organisations that spring up full of enthusiasm, but then fizzle out as speedily as they arose. Best wishes." All right. Nice comment.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Shall we move into the poetry segment?
Yep, let's go.
Poetry reading. All right, let me find it. All right, we're going to be reading The Heart of Australia by Henry Lawson. When the wars of the world seemed ended, and the silent, the distant drum, 10 years ago in Australia, I wrote of a war to come, and I pictured Australians fighting as their fathers fought of old, for the old things, pride or country, for the God or the devil or gold. And they lounged on the rim of Australia in the peace that had come to last. And they laughed at my cavalry charges, for such things belong to the past. And then our wise men smiled with indulgence, ere the swift years proved me right, saying, what shall Australia fight for, and whom shall Australia fight? I wrote of the unlocked rivers in the days when my heart was full, and I pleaded for irrigation where they sacrificed all for wool. I pictured Australians fighting when the coast had been lost and won, with arsenals west of the mountains, and every spur its gun. And what shall Australia fight for? The reason may yet be found, when strange shells scatter the wickets and burst on the football ground. And who shall invade Australia? Let the wisdom of ages say, the friend of the further future, or the ally of yesterday? Aye, what must Australia fight for, in the strife that never shall cease? She must fight for her work unfinished. She must fight for her life and peace. For the sins of the older nations, she must fight for her own reward. She has taken the sword in her blindness, and shall live or die by the sword. But the statesman, the churchman, the scholar, still peer through their glasses dim, and they see no cloud on the future as they roost on Australia's rim, where the farmer works with the lumpers, and the drover drives a dray, and the shearer on Garden Island, shifting a hill today. Had we used the wealth we have squandered, and the land that we had kept from the plough, a prosperous federal city would be over the mountains now, with farms that sweep to horizons, and gardens where plains lay bare, and the bulk of the population and the heart of Australia there. Had we used the time we had wasted, and the gold we have thrown away, and the pick of the world's mechanics would be over the range today, in the valley of coal and iron, where the breezes from the bush comes down, and where thousands of makers of all things should be happy in factory town. They droned on the rim of Australia, the wise men who never could learn, our substance we sent to the nations, and their shoddy we bought in return. In the end shall our soldiers fight naked, no help for them under the sun, and never a cartridge to stick in the breech of a Brummagem gun. With the wars of the world coming near us, the wise men are walking today. Hurry out ammunition from England, mount the guns on the cliff while you may, and God of pardon our sins as a people, if invasion's unmerciful hand should strike at the heart of Australia's drought cramped on the verge of the land. That was The Heart of Australia by Henry Lawson. That's a banger of a poem. That's a really good one.
I love it. It's so real. I mean, obviously this was written like very, it would have been turn of the 20th century. There's no, I've struggled to find a pinned date on this one.
I looked it up and I got 1904, but
yeah,
how accurate
that makes sense. Makes sense. It's it's the age old story of Australia's over reliance on the coastal areas here known as Australia's Rim, where we have invested, or shall we say, consumed the nation's wealth on like frivolous things instead of developing the interior. This is obviously at his time. Now, there were a lot of great projects that came after this poem was written, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's such a fascinating concept, the squandering of the land we kept from the plough. You know, a prosperous federal city that would be over the mountains now, where farms would sweep to the horizons and gardens where plains currently lay bare, and the bulk of the population and the heart of Australia there. It's good writing. I mean, this is a theme that ran right through the heart of a lot of Australia's founding visionaries. I mean, Charles Bean wrote a bit about this as well, about basically being a plantation economy and just producing wool and primary production and not having our own industries and cultivation of the interior and all the rest of it, which is always the dream of our founding forebears, to settle the interior properly.
It's amazing how much of this poem is still applicable today. Like the lines about the blindness of the statesman, the churchman, and the scholar. You know, just it brings to mind like our uni's reliance on foreign students and just general government ineptitude. So, literally could have been written today.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I like this message too. You know, what shall Australia fight for? In the strife that never shall cease, she must fight for her work unfinished. She must fight for her life and peace. For the sins of the older nations, she must fight for her own reward. She has taken the sword in her blindness, and she'll live or die by the sword. Yeah, this idea of this never-ending struggle for its life and peace and survival that's been right at the heart of the country since it was first settled. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
No. Let's move on to the rest of the episode.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. So what we're going to do, we're going to read essentially the better part, if not the whole, of chapter 4 of the Commonwealth of Australia, which is written by Bernhard. This is a cracker of a book of Australian history. Like, it's not an enormous book. It's about 400 pages. And it was written by a barrister, Bernhard, and it was dedicated to Alfred Deakin. And what he does in this book is he lays out a couple of chapters where he just gives a very overall summary of different points of Australian history and culture and settlement and all the rest of it. Now, in this the purpose of this episode was to kind of touch on Australian economics, or our way of doing things. And underpinning that, I think this chapter, which he calls Politics and the Working Man, really cuts to the heart of a lot of this stuff. We think Australian economics, you know, if you were to try to describe this school of economics, it's this kind of ruthless pragmatism where Australians acted and voted and conducted themselves in a manner without too much ideology, and more so just a healthy dose of pragmatic bipartisanship in delivering good outcomes for the nation as a whole. So I'll give a bit of a read into chunks that we think are worthy of discussing, and we'll see how we go. So, Chapter 4, Politics and the Working Man. To understand Australia, it's necessary to remember that it's a country of the man who works and not of the man of leisure. Luxury is rare because it's difficult to accumulate a large fortune and more difficult to spend it. but capacity of any sort is assured of a competence. There is thus a pleasant equality of condition, which neither excites envy nor depresses ambition. All work, too, is adjusted to the necessities of a more genial climate, so that the hours are shorter and the pressure of competition is less urgent than in older countries. At the same time, the wide horizons and the clear skies give a larger outlook upon life and encourage the characteristic qualities of freshness, sincerity, and confidence, whilst nowhere in the world can a man who has to work for his living work under pleasanter conditions than he can in Australia. This, which is true of all classes, is so in the preeminent degree of those who live by manual labour, who have used their political power to adjust industrial conditions, with more or less elaboration, by means of legislation to these fortunate circumstances. This fact explains the saying, to which reference has been made above, that Australia is the paradise of the working man. In no country in the world is political power more widely diffused or more daring use made of government action as an instrument of social development. Every man and woman in Australia has a vote, and no tradition limits its exercise to a selection between candidates of a certain social rank. Consequently, members of Parliament are of the same class as the majority of voters, and reflect both the opinions and the prejudices of their constituents, so that their standpoint is always that of the average citizen, who has no definite political creed, but who resents being patronised and is keenly alive to any opportunity of bettering his condition by means of legislation. The dominant idea of the average voter is to make Australia a better country to live in for men of his own class, for he has learned by experience that men of wealth and ability are well able to look after themselves, and so far from mistrusting governmental action, he draws legislation into his service as a ready and effective instrument of reform. This does not imply any adherence on his part to a particular theory of the functions of state, for the Australian is a voter and not a philosopher, and his democracy is not so much a reasoned creed as it is an instinct. Anything you want to say about that, Trent?
Well, is that still true, or has the ideological brainworms set in amongst the Australian population?
Yeah, I'd say that. I think they have been thoroughly. People like the midwit syndrome in this country is just on another level in terms of people who they watch the project on Seven and consider themselves extremely well-informed voters. The people that are voting in this country are like the same people who are calling the police on their neighbours for not wearing a COVID mask when they were mowing their lawn. The ideological, I don't know how further to explain. I think there's definitely more of an ideological bent now rather than just instinctive, self-serving voting, I would say.
Yeah, you should have a to-do list, not an ideology. That's how I'd put it.
Yeah.
And that when it comes up to election time, the fear mongering and the party that you don't like, they're coming for you, is so effective upon people that we're kind of trapped in this Liberal Labor hell spiral indefinitely.
It's also a function of the electoral system as well. I mean, I've mentioned before, in that last federal election, Labor say they got a landslide victory, and they did in terms of seats in Parliament, but their primary vote was only 34%. So 34% of the electorate put a number one next to the Labor Party, which it just shows our system is built for stability, but it has the adverse effect, however, of preventing breakaway electoral change because the preference voting system essentially leads to dominant dual force.
Have you got any strong opinions on compulsory voting?
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. It has like trade-offs. Like everything has trade-offs. My view on compulsory voting is it has a moderating effect. Means the political classes are chasing the central, what they consider to be the most middle of the lane vote to get most people over the line. Where in countries where there is no compulsory voting, they're more likely to chase fringes, which can be a good or a bad thing, like depending on who's going to win, right? I think the desired effect of having everyone engaged in democracy and this idea of that means people are going to read more and have more refined opinions on who to vote for, like was an obvious failure. But if your value proposition is stability and not extreme swings in government, then I think it's a winner. It really just depends. I've kind of got mixed feelings about it as well. I do about many other things.
I don't have mixed feelings. I hate it.
Yeah, fair enough. I can understand why. Like I'm definitely charitable to both points of view.
All right. Shall we return to the reading?
No worries. Okay, so a contrast of methods. This predilection of Australians for action by the state is the more noteworthy because in its striking contrast with the inclination of opinion in other democracies of British origin, which margins the Pacific. Contrasts between Australia and the United States will be noticed frequently by an observer of the two countries. This perhaps is one of the most intelligible because it can be traced to a difference in the early methods of government. The United States sprang from the town meeting, Australia from a personal government. The early settlements in New England were from the first self-governing communities. The settlement at Sydney Cove was subject to the orders of a naval or military officer for 38 years. The governor was an earthly providence to the early Australian settlers, dispensing food, controlling industry, and fixing the rate of wages. Nor did the influx of free settlers materially change the situation, because these spread themselves over a vast area of wasteland too quickly to acquire that local sentiment which became instinctive in the concentrated settlements on the Atlantic seaboard. There came indeed to be a strong provincial jealousy between the Australian colonies, which has defied even federation. But this was never incompatible with a very wide exercise of the powers of government within each colony. Thus, while the United States have developed an exaggerated localism and individualism, in no part of the world has the doctrine of laissez-faire fewer adherents than in Australia. Even the free traders reject the doctrine as applied to domestic politics. The administrative nihilism, to use Professor Huxley's phrase, which would confine the action of government to preserving order, always seemed treason to busy settlers who depended upon the action of always seemed treason to busy settlers who depended upon the action of the state to overcome many of the physical obstacles to settlement and to provide the means of railways, roads, tanks, etc., those conveniences of civilization which, in such a country as Australia, individuals could not obtain unaided. Thus, Australian governments have, for many years, constructed their own railways, trams and ferry boats, done their own printing, provided hospitals and parks, subsidised agricultural shows, and generally endeavoured to improve the means of communication and transport and develop the country. Governments now, in addition, make clothes for the police and military, maintain farms, own and let the use of batteries for crushing ore, own and let out bulls and stallions, supply seed wheat, sell frozen meat and dairy produce, export wines, send commercial agents to England and the East, undertake the storage and grading of meat and butter for export. And they're also expected to test new processes of production and supply free of charge, information as to the latest agricultural and industrial experiments in other countries. Indeed, a settler could hardly get greater assistance than every Australian state is now expected to furnish. These later extensions of state activity have rather been due to the widening of the field for work than to the influence of any political party, and are acquiesced in by all parties, because Australia was familiarised from its early days with the frequent exercise by the state of its organised power in order to overcome the critical difficulties of colonisation. Any comments there, Trent?
Do you agree with that US-Australia comparison? What was it? America born out of the town hall. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you think about like very early America, Plymouth Rock America, like the colonies were all essentially free companies run by like individual citizens. Although they were still subjects of the crown, they were so much more isolated and self-governing in more democratic styles of local governance. I think that is a true statement. That's just my opinion anyway. Like, I think that makes sense to me. And then obviously, like that has an impact on their cultural development and this kind of laissez-faire individualism, which was far stronger there than in Australia. I don't know. What did you think? Did you think that's a bit overblown or what?
No, I think it's fair. I think there's plenty of other factors like geography, technology, geopolitical situation at the founding of both the countries in question. But I think the general sentiment is correct without going into all those other factors.
Yeah, I find it funny they call the American style of restrained government merely to preserve order as administrative nihilism. So like, I've never, that expression, Professor Huxley, shout out to whoever that is, coining that phrase. It is true though. Like, you think about it from an economic point of view, when Australia's settlement was being undertaken, like, the American experience is different. They had hundreds of, they had millions more people than we did in our early history. Their population was very, very significant. By the time, industrial era stuff came along, they had more economies of scale to really do this kind of laissez-faire style market economy. Even then, like, the railways into the West, like after the Civil War, for instance, all of that was erased to get government subsidies. So it was never completely, like, it is kind of overblown that how laissez-faire it was. Like, they say, this is just a complete free market or whatever. The United States absolutely had protection of infant industries. Like, they had tariffs. They used tariffs to finance infrastructure. They use it to build dams and all the rest of it. So I guess that is true on one hand, but they are also ideologically considering themselves to be laissez-faire. Or I think in Australia, it was kind of the opposite, where pragmatically we were doing state paternalism, building railroads and all the rest of it, but not even thinking about it very ideologically. It's just like, this is just a necessity because this is the way things have to be. Like, in a country of Australia, like 19th century Australia had a few million people in it, less than 10 million. We're talking, 5 or 6 million just after the gold rush, thereabouts. Mostly in a few industrial cities, and then small populations scattered all over the frontier, the economies of scale that you need to finance a railroad, the market, there's just simply not enough goods to justify building a railroad. Let's say New South Wales talk, like what was the Queanbeyan to Bombala line, which goes through my area of the Snowy Mountains. Sure, there's wool, there's passengers, there's all of that. Like there was a market for it, but there was not a market strong enough that private capital would look at that and say, oh yeah, I'm going to risk it and throw my money at that, because the return on investment, whilst it exists, it is not such that people would want to bear the risk and run at the investment. Now, the free market nerds, the laissez-faire libertarians, of which I was one when I was a teenager, but I have since repented, they will tell you that it's not the place of the state to make bets with taxpayer money, which, I can sympathize with that point of view to some degree. But the side of this which needs to be considered is that creating that infrastructure in the first place, at the time you create it, it may not have great appetite for a return on investment, but it actually opens new markets and creates new opportunities, which the market can then actually exploit. So, like for instance, the Snowy Hydro scheme, which redirected much of the Snowy River west into the Riverina, that was a state-funded enterprise. And with all of that water now available in the Murrumbidgee district, in the Riverina, the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, as it's now known, that created conditions where private capital were now happy and willing and now enabled to start these giant vineyards and farms and productive agriculture in what was formerly a wasteland, which just did not have enough rainfall for any productive work other than livestock. So there's definitely a case for the state to invest in building this infrastructure, which opens avenues for private capital to find the best use of the output. But that's kind of what Bernhard is talking about here, that the Australian state provided railways and did a lot of extra stuff as well. I mean, it got to pretty insane levels of state stuff. I mean, like making clothes for the police and military and running agricultural events and stuff like that. And like there's a bit of a degree of discussion about how far do you go. But I think in the main, this idea of state paternalism and creating the enabling forces to improve market conditions, I think, is a good policy.
All right. Shall we continue with the reading?
Sure. Next section, he says, Australian socialism. So he says, yet with all this extension of state activities, there is less socialist legislation in Australia than in England. Australian legislation is advanced only when the small size of the community and the sparseness of its population necessitates legislation. In England, it's done by economic compulsion. For example, in England, the chief standard industries are regulated by joint committees of workmen and employers who determine all disputes and are able, through the concentration of the industry, to enforce their rulings by the penalty of exclusion from trade. In Australia, where industries are small and scattered and men change easily from one employer to another, the same result can only be achieved by the compulsion of law through the awards of a tribunal. It's true that the laws of labour in factories and shops are shorter than in England, but in all other respects, factory legislation is less strict in Australia than in England. Again, there is no poor law in Australia, and there's nothing like the advanced municipal socialism of cities like Glasgow. The laws for the protection of workmen are far less stringent than in England. where there is no Workmen's Compensation Act, and the doctrine of common employment is in full force. In the supervision of food, except meat, milk, and butter for export, the sanitation, except quarantine, and regulation of workmen's dwellings and new streets and buildings, Australia is decades behind the legislation of Great Britain. Yet, according to the popular view, Australia is a warning to the world by reason of its socialist legislation. The explanation of this contrast between appearance and reality is due to the fact that the Australian inclination to invoke state aid, which had its origin in the history of the country, has found support of late years in a more or less defined political creed, which has found in Australia its most vigorous and clear expression, although it's not distinctively Australian nor of Australian origin. So, comment there.
I've got nothing to add on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. I think that he makes a good point. Like, you know, they sook and whinge about Australia being this deeply socialistic kind of country, but in reality, the actual the net result, it was actually still a freer country and a more market oriented country, and a fair chunk of the state intervention really was not wealth transfer. It was industrial awards, yes, and then also expanding the market. So yeah, anyway, that's okay if you don't have much to add on that. The next part is social progress versus material advance. History, from one point of view, is only an ever-varying adjustment between the rights of the individual and the claim of society. One school of thought, holding that society grows through an automatic harmonizing of many self-interests, would extend the sphere of the individual action to its widest limits, compatible with the security of life and property. Another school insists that the conflict of self-interests does not produce harmony, but anarchy, and it accordingly demands restrictions upon competition in order to preserve society. In the economic field, disciples of the former school concentrate their efforts on encouraging production because they believe that unrestricted liberty to produce secures, by some decree of providence, a just distribution of the products. The other school, except its socialist section, does not reject competition, but demands that this shall be in fact the competition of equal units, which English economists postulate, but which has never existed in any industrial society except possibly between wholesale dealers during the 30 years between 1840 and 70, when there were no trusts and foreign states had not begun to organise national industries by means of tariffs, subsidies and railways. These views express the divergence of opinion between capital and labour which exists today in many parts of the world. In Australia, it's widened and accentuated by some distinctive social and historical conditions. Australia, as has been pointed out, is a country in which every man and woman has a vote. It has also been familiarised from its birth with an active and centralised government. There is accordingly nothing novel or repellent to the Australian in the idea that the organised power of the state should be used to further his ideals of social reform. On the other hand, a young country offers very great opportunities to private enterprise and tends to develop self-reliance and impatience of control to a high degree. These qualities do not, however, counteract the tendency to rely upon the interference of the state, because the vicissitudes of fortune in a young country and the haphazard way in which she casts her favours make the unsuccessful envious or indifferent, while the men of enterprise who would mistrust governments are too much occupied with their own affairs to take an influential part in politics. Riches, which imply responsibilities and in appearance reward merit, are more kindly regarded than the sudden acquisitions of Australian speculators, which give their possessor very little power over the opinion of others. A writer of a most interesting series of articles on Australian ideals, which appeared in the Times of July and August 1908, has very acutely pointed out that alongside the individual struggle after wealth, there was a growing in Australia from very early times a different spirit sown by men who sought not so much wealth as ease and competence. This spirit was helped in its gradual evolution from an instinctive and unconvinced sentiment to the main article in a political faith by the same circumstances peculiar to Australia, which gave such extensive play to the material ambition of the abler part of the community. If cloistral isolation and peace favoured the concentration of many people upon the business of developing the country and growing rich, it also left their poorer and less enterprising brethren free to speculate upon possibilities of moderate affluence without excessive toil and of a widespread social well-being inconceivable to countries less richly endowed, less thinly peopled, and less remote. Hidden in a corner of the Pacific and safeguarded by no effort of her own against the interference of a jealous world, Australia has developed a quality of introspection, a hermit-like preoccupation with her own dreams, and which is now a leading attribute of her political ideas. Any comment on that?
Well, there's a few things in there that I think might have changed over time. There was the line about the average Australian not being loath to seek assistance from the state, and at the time when this was development, the building of rails and bridges and that sort of thing, I think that's true. But now, when we live in our degenerated, multi-billion-dollar NDIS being the only thing powering the economy, I think increasingly Australians are becoming horrified at the government interference. And would you say that we still have a quality of introspection and a hermit-like preoccupation with our own dreams?
Not anymore.
Nah. I feel like the
dream is dead. The people that are dreaming about going to Bali. That's as high ideals as it gets on the average, I'd say.
Yeah.
But it paints a beautiful picture, hidden in the corner of the Pacific, safeguarded from the interference of a jealous world, a quality of introspection and preoccupation with her own dreams. You think about the founders of the country. I mean, we uploaded a lot of pictures recently on Aesthetics from an old newspaper, an illustrated newspaper, which was out in this. It was the Sunraysia Daily, which had a number of illustrations which showed these qualities of this kind of idealism about building this utopia on the interior of Australia and working hard and cultivating the land and building this new beautiful society protected from trade. And there's the picture of like the German guy being stopped at the gate with all these cheap imports and this big tariff wall keeping out all this like foreign goods. This idea of this self-reliant craftsman industrial economy, I think was a big deal. And this idea of being a young country full of opportunities, and that the men who charge ahead and work hard are rewarded for it, and then everyone else in his wake is still living like an honest kind of get an honest share of his own labours as well. It's nice idealism in my mind anyway.
Yeah, it's the like the lifters and loafers concept, but it's a more genteel version of it, you know, where it's not as you know, how does he put it? The abler and the less enterprising.
Yeah.
It is a better picture than the one we have today.
Yeah, that's right. The other thing that's worthy mention here is he mentions this quote, this big quote, which we read towards the end there, is from Australian Ideals. He didn't actually mention the author, but it's actually Henry Higgins. He did a series of works on Australian Ideals. One of them is on the ANA Wiki, so if you haven't read it, have a look. Henry Higgins being the former High Court Justice who decided the Harvester case, and he was a Labor man and a good lawyer, and he was a staunch advocate for Australian Ideals. It has a good commentary on the White Australia policy in there as well, and the struggle between this kind of wealth, the pursuit of like capital, and then the pursuit of the well-being of the nation. Jump onto the next section.
Yep.
A policy, not a philosophy. It is almost needless to say that Australia, being a British community, ideas are not built up into any consistent theory. Thus, although the division of sentiment in Australia does run parallel with the cleavage in opinion which has been described above, the philosophy of the matter is little considered, and yet the conflicts are not between rival schools of thought. There is an essential difference between the ideals of each party, however little this may be generally recognised, which perhaps will be made clearer by a description of the extreme views of either side. Again, we quote the writer of the articles in the Times. At the extreme of one category is a large number of purely selfish individuals who, regardless of any interest but their own, are merely in a hurry to grow rich. At the expense of the other, at the extreme of the other is a still larger number of more or less predatory socialists who demand a share of the general prosperity out of all proportion to their share of effort in creating it. Going into one class, wrote Sir Henry Parkes in his 50 Years in the Making of Australian History. He wrote, "You will find men carefully dressed, sumptuously fed, who are very much disposed to taking a shortcut to the objective which they wish to reach, without reference to the feelings or the reasonable wishes or even the lawful privileges of their fellows. Going among another class, almost the opposite, you will see men savagely assail their fellows because they honestly strive in their own way as free men to earn the means of subsistence for their families. The aims of these two classes will always essentially be antagonistic. The one will lay most stress on material advance, the other will place social progress in the forefront of its program. And as the political power is within the advocates of social progress, we shall expect to find on the Australian Statute Book many protests against unrestrained individualism, which would cause the same estrangement between classes in Australia as it has in older countries. And in this respect also, Australia offers another marked contrast to the United States. Indeed, the motto of Australian supporters of reform might also be to make Australia everything America is not. So strenuous is the struggle against the rule of wealth, and so deep-seated are the lessons which have been taught to Australians by the recent disclosures of social anarchy in the United States. Australia, it is claimed, should be so governed that it shall provide work at fair wages to a vast industrial population, afford a fair day's wage to good workers, and provide such comfortable and healthy conditions that the workers may take an interest in their work, have leisure for culture and recreation. It is thought better that Australia should have a large, well-educated, contented working population, then it should produce immense yields of wool or cotton by means of servile or low-paid labour. Such views plainly involve the swallowing of economic formula and suggest that freedom of contract, the law of supply and demand, and similar phrases are mere capitalistic shibboleths which mark an arrogant contempt for social rights. Legislation is treated as a means not only for removing inequalities, but of protecting the weak against the strong. The organised political exponent of these views is the Australian Labor Party, which plays so large a part in Australian affairs and is credited with playing one so much larger than an account from its formation and policy, it cannot be omitted from an account of the Commonwealth and will form the subject of the next chapter. The end.
All right.
What do you think of that? There's a cracker there about making Australia everything America is not. That still runs so deep today, and you see that exemplified everywhere. Like, especially, I mean, particularly since the Trump election victory in 2016. Like,
the project fans.
That's right.
Yeah,
the midwit Australian is just obsessed with how dumb Americans are and how stupid they must all be, and just like they really riff on this idea of being everything America is not. It's like anything we do has to be the default opposite of whatever the United States does, whether it's good, right, or wrong. It's just like that's the default orientation.
Well, yeah, simultaneously while we're, they're our biggest defense partner and a massive economic partner, and we're just utterly saturated in their cultural output.
Yeah.
It's a bit schizophrenic, that attitude. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't like the Great Satan much more than anyone else, but I just think it's just the contemptuous kind of attitude of the midwit against America. It's like all for the wrong reasons as well. It's like it's not like they dislike America because Hollywood has totally undermined and destroyed Australian culture or whatever. It's like, oh, we hate America because they have firearms and they don't they don't have Medicare. It's got to be destroyed.
Yeah. Well, hating on Americans is quite trad in Australia.
Yes.
We're coming up soon to the anniversary of the Battle of Brisbane, so just never forget to hate seppos.
True.
There was the Parks comments about the two classes, about the upwardly mobile class that's just stepping on everybody, and then the bottom class that is wanting the handout, the predatory socialist. I think one thing that was left out of that description was the middle class, in between the middle of the pyramid, that is just being absolutely crushed by the bottom of the pyramid and the top. Yeah, so a little oversight there.
Yeah, well, I think he was just kind of looking at two extremes of the spectrum. I think what's interesting analysis when it comes to the Labor Party in its founding principles at the time of Federation, they had this idea, and Andrew Fisher, who was like the first Labor Prime Minister for a brief period, did great justice to this idea of the speculator versus the worker. So like in Labor Party ideology, like producerism is what we call it. There's this idea of everyone who works should be rewarded for his work. And a person who work, that could be a labourer, but it could also be a manager or a professional or an executive, like someone who's actually grinding shall be rewarded for their grind. But people who merely own like equity, like own shares, people who own assets, rent seekers, essentially. Although the Labor Party had no desire to do away with a market system or do away with systems where you could be rewarded from holding assets or holding equity in companies and things like that. They had the view that the configuration of the tax system and the configuration of market conditions should prioritize the benefit of those who work rather than speculators. So, and one thing which spills into our next little quick subject to comb into was land ownership. And that is like a very hot issue in Australia today. But what's not often recognised or commonly discussed is the land boom in Australia before Federation. So in the late 19th century, property speculators, people with cash, were buying up massive land holdings. And in those days, there was no land taxation system. So people were land banking and drip feeding land into the market so that they could keep the price of land high. And so there was, in some areas, a housing crisis not too dissimilar to what we deal with today. And one of the main causes in the land boom was, all these land speculators who were banking land, buying land, and then just slowly drip feeding it into the market, which is what property developers do now. There's no two doubts about it. Obviously, the immigration numbers now are significant, and the planning constraints and the costs of construction are astronomical as well. So it's like we have the perfect storm now. In the land boom in the 19th century, it was mainly property speculators because the zoning laws didn't exist. You could just build a shack, and if you bought land, you'd be sweet. And there was much lower immigration numbers. But it's fascinating, this idea. So in the Labor Party world, in one of their founding principles was this idea of having the progressive land tax, which is based on the Henry George school of making sure there's essentially a market signal. Like if you're just sitting on land, not using it for its productive purpose, you need to pay the state essentially a penalty, which will incentivize you to sell it to someone who will use it productively, like for farming or for living on, or for some other industry, or you retain it and pay a tax on it, and that tax can go to the consolidated fund of the state, which can be used to benefit the people more broadly. So with that, we might quickly skip over to an article from the Wagga Wagga newspaper, The Worker, in 1913. Did you want to have a crack at reading this for us?
Yes. Yep. Wagga Worker, Labor Party and land monopoly. Land monopoly has been the curse of Australia. Man can no more live without land than he can live without air, but the ownership of a great part of the best lands of Australia has, after a little over a century of the white man's occupation, drifted into the hands of a very few people. The effects of these unnatural conditions have been widespread and disastrous. The growth of population has been retarded, the resources of the country undeveloped, the population forced into the great capital cities, in not one case, but many country towns in the most fertile districts, have been literally strangled by the iron ring of land monopoly drawn tight around them. A country like ours wants many relatively small, flourishing towns surrounded by living farms, orchards, and settlements, rather than a few huge, overgrown, congested cities and a deserted countryside. But while one or two men own all the land round about our country towns, such a policy is in most cases impossible. The Labor Party is against land monopoly, for land monopoly means that the few are able to block the opportunities which should be open to all. This is one of the greatest countries on earth. Its resources are the richest and most varied, but in order to develop them, there must be access to land. Therefore, when the best lands are held by a few, development of our resources is impossible. The industrial and general progress of the nation is reduced almost to a standstill. The facts show that there was never a more all-round successful piece of practical legislation in our history. Never was a great problem more boldly yet sanely attacked. Never have the prophecies of our opponents been so completely falsified. The Fusion Party said the effect of the tax would be to absolutely ruin landholders and make the land a drug in the market. Time has most effectively disproved this. Land has not become a drug on the market. It was never more sought after. What the federal land tax has done is to steady the price of land, which, with the greatly increased demand for land consequent upon the general prosperity and the increase of immigration, 3 times as many people have come here during the Labor regime than in the 20 years previously, would have become too dear for the average man to buy. The tax has stimulated transactions in land. Land sales were never so numerous. Bona fide land settlement never progressed so rapidly. What the land tax has done: in every state, the progressive land tax has caused great estates to be cut up. Further aggregation has been checked, and the tax will continue to act in this direction. Think what this blows at land monopoly means. Remember that the land tax has not only placed Australians on land where they can get a decent living, but has been the means of putting 1,100,334 and 718 more acres under cultivation, and has attracted and is attracting an ever-increasing number of the right kind of immigrants who desire to settle on the land and develop its resources. And that was the Labor Party and Land Monopoly by Mr. J.A. Arthur, and that was published in The Worker of Wagga Wagga in 1913.
Certified banger. That's on the ANA wiki as well.
Yeah, well, good chance to plug the wiki. Everyone jump on the ausnatives.org website, go to the menu, go to the wiki, bookmark it. There's so much good stuff on there. Next time you're in a waiting room or you're catching a train or something, get on the wiki, have a bit of a look around. There's just so much great stuff on there. Man, another one that could have been written today, like not all of it, but a lot of the points in it.
Yeah.
It's particularly a sore issue for people today. The cost of housing, the massive congested cities, and the dying regional towns. Very prescient.
It's so real. The analogous stuff between our history today and the end of the 19th century is just scary sometimes. But the words strike so hard, that second paragraph. The effects of these unnatural conditions have been widespread and disastrous. The growth of the population has been retarded. The resources of the country undeveloped. The populations forced into the great capital cities, he puts in quotes. In not one case, but many country towns in the most fertile districts have been literally strangled by the iron ring of land monopoly drawn tightly around them. A country like ours wants many relatively small, flourishing towns with living farms, orchards, and settlements, rather than a few huge, overgrown, congested cities and a deserted countryside. I heard it said more than half of Australia in population lives in Melbourne and Sydney. I don't know if Brisbane was in that as well, but these mega disgusting cities. And look, personally, I'm a man. I absolutely hate urban existence. I really despise cities generally. I don't think it's natural or healthy. I think everyone should have soil. Everyone should be not under the shadow of great towers and buildings and congested traffic and all the rest of it. You should be out where the trees grow, where you can ambiently hear the song of the birds and the mooing of the cow in the evening. But that's just me. I'm strongly opposed to the urban experience. So this breed of politics hits me particularly hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, it sounds like you were going to say something.
Oh, well, there was another line in here. 3 times as many people have come here during the Labor regime than in the 20 years previously. And obviously, in this context, when they were trying to populate the land and settle the land, develop the land, that would have been a huge boon, like a selling point. Look at how many people we've got to come here and join us in 1913. But again, another sentence that could be written today, but is a one sentence horror story.
Well, that's right. I love it how he ends the whole thing with with this, we've now got over 1 million acres under cultivation, which wasn't there before, and attracting an ever increasing number of the right kind of immigrants. I do like the right kind of immigrant. We do, we're not. I mean, maybe in 2025, we're probably just generally anti-immigration, but there's definitely a time and a place for the right kind of immigrant, the European stock descent kind of immigrant, which is what they had in 1913 at the height of the White Australia policy. You can look at the Sunraysia Daily and these newspaper I mentioned before, and just the optimism for growing these towns out in the interior with irrigation and just off the Murray River and building these huge farms and growing grapes and prunes and all the rest of it. It's just like, it's such a cool thing. I don't know if you've ever been to the Riverland before because you're up in Queensland, but I went for a family holiday there a few years ago. We went through Mildura and Renmark and some of the irrigation country, Griffith and all of that. It's an amazing district because it's all built off the back of this kind of garden the inland plain sentiment, which Henry Lawson's really big on, this cultivating entrepreneurial farming people. And none of that would have happened if these land monopolies weren't broken up by the progressive land tax. And before the land tax came in, as he rightfully mentions, the Fusion Party or the more liberal, like the free traders and protectionists who were a bit more capitalistic in their mindset, they were deadly terrified. Well, at least some of them were of the land tax because they thought it would destroy property ownership and all the rest of it. But there's one really good quote by Joseph Cook, and this is from the Parliamentary Hansard. And Joe Cook, he's not a rapid socialist or whatever you would want to call him. But here I'll read out a quote from him. He says, "It's the one thing above all others that has cursed this country, and it has cursed every other country of which we have any knowledge. And unless it be abolished, it will be a curse. It will curse these countries in the future as they have not yet been cursed. The initial wrong done to society is in attempting to recognize such a thing as property in land. There can be no property in land in the sense that there is property in houses or in anything else that men make by the use of their muscle and brain. Property in land is a thing which no man can make, and although he may possess it, the only thing that can possibly make private property in land is old legal enactments which have given away the people's birthright and are now making it possible for men who never did a day's work in their lives to pass stringent measures exacting tribute from men who are craving the means of existence. Private property in land is the step to all other movements going in the wrong direction, and we must retrace it or suffer the evil consequence which will be disastrous to our country and civilization. The great evil in this country is that, while its industries are declining, there is under the present system of government no possibility of creating alternate employment for the people. To put this matter in plain language, the land grabbers and land speculators have this country by the throat." And that was in 1909, so it was a few years before the land tax. Now, there's some controversial things there, and if you're not deep into the Georgist theory of land ownership and land tax and all the rest, you might be quite offended at some of the words there. So I'll try to explain very quickly as a quick little rundown.
Yeah, not the episode for libertarians.
No, libertarians are on suicide watch right now. So Joe Cook here was like leaning on the Georgist idea of like land ownership versus land possession, and capital and all of that kind of stuff get confused with land in modern terms. So it's kind of hard to explain easily. But essentially, in the Georgist regime, everyone would pay a land tax on the unimproved value of the land, which means if you improved the land by working on it, by using capital to build structures or build annexures to the land which added value, or you sweated your own labor on the land, you wouldn't be penalized. You wouldn't be taxed on the value of that. You would only be taxed on the unimproved value of the land. And obviously there's like some deep philosophical points of view on this, right? Like libertarians love the idea of paying for land once and for all, and then just never having to pay a tax on it ever again. But they're not acknowledging the fact that the state has to defend their property rights from abuses of others, criminals, or foreign armies invading the country and taking the land off you. There's that, and then obviously all the other environmental things as well, like preventing pollutants and all that from entering your land, which, despite the fetish of the libertarians, cannot all be settled in the courtroom. You need the force of arms of a standing army and a law enforcement system to kind of uphold your property rights in the first place. So you've got to pay tax on it. There's no getting away with that. But the other side of this as well is, this idea of the speculator, going back to Andrew Fisher, the speculator, the rent seeker versus the worker, the entrepreneurial worker who takes possession of land and uses it for its best productive purpose is not punished under this kind of Georgist style regime. He's rewarded for his labors. But the speculator who sits and land banks and speculates on asset prices and doesn't actually do any productive stuff with the land is essentially penalized by the taxation regime. And this kind of throws into ideas about the current capital gains tax system. And speculating on assets is not a productive use of your money. It should be producing new assets or doing some other productive thing with capital, rather than just swapping assets, or in this case, land banking, and putting an iron ring around the throat of every country town in Australia and drip feeding land supply into the market to keep prices high, like Kulak style speculator stuff. So I don't know. It's interesting. Like in contemporary conversations about labor and capital and economic theory, there's very little justice done to land and kind of rent-seeking ideas of, should we be favoring workers over speculators or asset owners, or should we be favoring asset owners over workers? Because in the current economic conditions, asset owners are strongly favored over productive labor and productive capital. Because you can be pro-capital, pro-market economy, whilst also being in favor of a tax system which incentivizes the most productive use of land, and not land banking or speculating. But that's my rant, mate. What did you think about that?
I'm largely in agreement with that. I don't find any of that too controversial. But again, like going back to the top of the conversation when we were talking about like pragmatism and what works, that just seems like it works. It doesn't. It's not an ideological issue for me.
Yeah, it's like a pragmatic economic approach rather than just like looking at what's right or wrong or what should be. It's like based on kind of abstract ideas. It's like, well, practically, the learned experience is if you don't have a progressive land tax of some kind, the market there's no real market incentive to divvy up these big land estates at a rate which is going to lead to the production of towns and industries and farms in the interior. What you end up getting is everyone in these huge cities piled on top of each other like rats, and you get the people who got in first, who inherit land and pass on land to their descendants, just drip feeding land supply into the market at a rate which is only necessary to maintain their high standard of living. So, yeah, you could the libertarians are going to hate me now, but it is what it is. I believe in settling the interior. I believe in small farms. I believe in industry. And I believe, as Joseph Cook does, that the country should not be strangled by the throat by landholders. That's not the greatest end in economic theory.
All right. Well, that seems like a good note to end on.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Let us know in the comments what topics you would like to hear about from us, or if there's a particular topic relating to Australia or the ANA that you would like us to do a show on. Please like, subscribe, leave us a comment. And as always, if you're interested in the ANA and you want to join, reach out to us. You can find us at oznatives.org.
The song and the story.